When most people think of Vietnam, they think of war, but that's only a small part of the story. Vietnam's history does not begin in the 20th century. It stretches back over 2,000 years, through periods of indigenous kingdoms, foreign domination, and continuous struggle for autonomy. From early civilizations in the Red River Delta to centuries of resistance against Imperial China, Vietnam developed a political and cultural identity shaped by both influence and defiance. By the 19th century, that pattern of external pressure continued under French colonial rule, which restructured the economy and governance of the region while suppressing local authority. Resistance movements emerged in response, laying the groundwork for the nationalist movements that would later define the 20th century. The wars that brought Vietnam into global attention, the First Indochina War and the Vietnam War, were not isolated conflicts. They were part of a longer continuum of struggle, where independence, ideology, and international geopolitics converged in one region. But reducing Vietnam to its wars overlooks the broader reality. Because alongside conflict, Vietnam's history is also one of continuity, of cultural endurance, economic adaptation, and national reconstruction. After decades of warfare, the country underwent significant transformation, rebuilding its infrastructure, redefining its economy, and integrating into the global system in ways that continue to evolve today. The implication is clear. Vietnam is not defined by war. War is only one chapter in a much longer story, one shaped by persistence, adaptation, and a history that extends far beyond the battlefield. Vietnam's history goes back over 4,000 years. Long before modern nations emerged in Europe, complex societies were already forming in what is now Vietnam, rooted in river systems, agriculture, and early technological innovation. Archaeological evidence from northern Vietnam reveals the rise of advanced Bronze Age cultures, most notably the Dong Son culture. Flourishing around the Red River Delta, this civilization developed sophisticated metalworking techniques, producing intricate bronze tools, weapons, and ceremonial drums, some of the most refined artifacts in Southeast Asia at the time. These were not isolated communities. They cultivated rice, built river-based economies, and established trade networks that extended across the region, connecting Vietnam to wider Southeast Asian systems. What challenges the common assumption is this: Vietnam was not a passive region shaped only by outside influence. While there were cultural exchanges with neighboring civilizations, archaeological research shows strong local development, indicating that many of these technologies and artistic traditions were created and refined within the region itself. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's history is not just long, it is deeply rooted in early innovation, regional influence, and cultural continuity that predates many later state systems. Because when you look closely, Vietnam doesn't enter history late. It helps shape it from the beginning. A nation shaped by resistance. For over 1,000 years, what is now Vietnam existed under the control of powerful Chinese dynasties, beginning in 111 BC and lasting, with interruptions, until the 10th century. But this period was not simply one of domination. Under Chinese rule, the region was transformed, administrative systems, writing, philosophy, and agricultural techniques were introduced into the Red River Delta, reshaping society in lasting ways. And yet, something just as important was happening beneath the surface. Resistance. From early uprisings like the rebellion of the Trung sisters in 40 CE to repeated revolts over centuries, local populations resisted assimilation and preserved key elements of their identity. Even while adopting aspects of Chinese governance and culture, they maintained their own language, traditions, and social structures. This tension defined the era. Vietnam was not simply absorbed, it was reshaped through a continuous struggle between external control and internal identity. And when Chinese authority weakened in the early 10th century, that long resistance culminated in independence, marked by the victory of Ngo Nguyen in 939 CE. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's national identity was not formed in isolation, it was forged through centuries of pressure, adaptation, and resistance. Because this was not just a story of occupation. It was a story of survival. A river decided the fate of empires. In the year 938, on a quiet waterway in northern Vietnam, a battle unfolded that would redefine the region's history, not through sheer force, but through strategy, timing, and deep knowledge of the land. At the Battle of Bac Dang River, Vietnamese forces led by No Nguyen faced an invading fleet from the southern Han dynasty. Outmatched in naval strength, they did not meet the enemy head-on. Instead, they turned the river itself into a weapon. Hidden beneath the surface, thousands of sharpened wooden stakes had been planted deep into the riverbed, completely invisible when the tide was high. As the invading fleet advanced inland, Vietnamese boats engaged briefly, then retreated, deliberately luring the enemy further upstream into the trap. Then the river changed. As the tide receded, the hidden stakes emerged. The larger enemy ships, now stranded and immobilized, were pierced, shattered, and thrown into chaos. Vietnamese forces launched a counterattack, destroying much of the fleet and killing its commander. The result was decisive. The invading force was defeated, and in the following year, No Nguyen declared independence, ending more than 1,000 years of Chinese domination over the region. And the implication is clear. This was not just a military victory, it was a demonstration of how intelligence, terrain, and timing could overcome superior force. It proved that control of the environment could outweigh numbers and power. Because at Bac Dang, the river didn't just shape the battle. It won it. Scholars once ruled the country. For centuries in Vietnam, political power was not decided by birthright alone, but by knowledge. At the center of this system was a Confucian examination structure that determined who could enter government service. Beginning in the 11th century and lasting in various forms until the early 20th century, Vietnam adopted and developed a civil service examination system inspired by Confucian ideals. Candidates were tested on classical texts, literature, ethics, and political philosophy, knowledge drawn from the Confucian canon. Those who succeeded were selected as scholar officials, forming the backbone of imperial administration. This created a unique structure of governance. Instead of military power or aristocratic inheritance alone, bureaucratic authority depended heavily on academic success. Local schools prepared candidates for provincial, metropolitan, and royal-level exams, each stage narrowing the field until only the most accomplished scholars reached official positions. And the influence extended beyond politics. This system shaped social hierarchy, education, and cultural identity. Mastery of Confucian learning became not only a pathway to office, but a symbol of status and legitimacy across Vietnamese society. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's imperial system was not just administrative, it was intellectual. Governance was built around the idea that knowledge itself was power, and that those who understood the classics were best suited to rule. Because in this system, authority was not inherited. It was earned through study. A capital built for emperors. Along the banks of the Perfume River in central Vietnam lies Hue, a city that once stood at the heart of imperial power, designed not as an ordinary capital, but as a carefully planned seat of dynasty and authority. From 1802 to 1945, Hue served as the political and cultural center of the Nguyen dynasty, Vietnam's last imperial ruling family. During this period, emperors constructed an entire complex of fortified citadels, palaces, temples, and administrative structures, engineered to reflect both governance and symbolism. At its core was the imperial city, enclosed within massive walls and layered defenses, designed not only for administration but for protection and ceremonial order. The layout itself reflected hierarchy, separating public authority, royal life, and sacred imperial space within distinct zones. But Hue was not just political architecture. It was also a cultural system, where art, education, and Confucian governance merged into a unified imperial identity. The city became a symbol of centralized authority, where every structure reinforced the idea of a structured, scholarly monarchy. Even today, the remains of this imperial design still define the landscape, recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site for its historical and architectural significance. And the implication is clear. Hue was not simply a capital city. It was a statement, built to project order, legitimacy, and imperial vision across an entire nation. Because in Vietnam's history, this was where emperors didn't just rule. They were built into the city itself. Rice fueled an empire. In Vietnam's early history, survival was never just about territory or armies, it was about control of water. Across the Red River Delta, one of the most densely populated and agriculturally productive regions in Southeast Asia, complex irrigation and water management systems became the foundation of society itself. Over thousands of years, communities developed networks of dikes, canals, and controlled flooding systems designed to regulate the unpredictable rhythms of the river. These weren't simple improvements, they were coordinated, large-scale engineering efforts that allowed wet rice cultivation to thrive in flood-prone land. Rice cultivation in the region dates back millennia, tied closely to early civilizations in the Red River Basin, where agricultural productivity supported rising population density and the development of complex societies. The Dong Sun culture itself, one of the earliest advanced Bronze Age societies in the area, was built around wet rice farming and water-dependent agriculture. But the real transformation came from control. By managing water flow, through embankments, canals, and later more sophisticated irrigation structures, Vietnamese society stabilized rice production, allowing harvests to become more reliable and intensive. This stability supported population growth and helped sustain early political structures in the region. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's historical strength did not come from conquest alone, it came from engineering the land itself to sustain life. Water control became power, and rice became the system that held it together. Because in Vietnam's early civilization, empire was not just built on land. It was built on water. Women led armies. In the year 40 CE, in what is now northern Vietnam, resistance against Chinese rule took an unexpected form. At its center were two sisters, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi, who would come to lead one of the earliest recorded rebellions in Vietnamese history. Trung Trac, a noblewoman whose husband had been executed by a local Chinese official, is widely cited in historical records as the catalyst for the uprising. Together with her younger sister, she mobilized local aristocrats and communities across the Red River Delta, forming a coordinated resistance against Han administration. What followed was not a small revolt, but a large-scale movement. The sisters gathered forces from multiple regions and, according to historical accounts, succeeded in capturing dozens of fortified settlements, briefly establishing an independent rule with Trung Trac proclaimed as ruler. For a short period, their authority extended across a significant portion of northern Vietnam, demonstrating not only military organization but also political structure under their leadership. But the response from the Han dynasty was overwhelming. A large imperial force under General Ma Yuan was dispatched, and by 43 CE the rebellion was suppressed. The sisters were defeated, marking the end of their brief independence. And yet, the implication remains powerful. This was not just a rebellion, it was a moment that challenged assumptions about leadership, gender, and resistance in early Southeast Asian society. Because in Vietnam's early history, war was not only led by kings and generals. Sometimes, it was led by sisters. Colonized but never fully controlled. In the 19th century, Vietnam was drawn into the expanding reach of the French Empire and became part of French Indochina, alongside Laos and Cambodia. By the mid to late 1800s, French forces had established colonial administration, reshaping political structures, economy, and trade across the region. But control on paper did not mean control on the ground. From the very beginning of colonial rule, Vietnam was marked by resistance. Local uprisings and guerrilla movements emerged repeatedly, refusing full submission to foreign authority. Even as French institutions expanded, opposition persisted across villages, provinces, and later organized nationalist movements. This resistance intensified over time. By the 20th century, anti-colonial movements had grown into coordinated national forces, culminating in prolonged conflict during the First Indochina War, where Vietnamese revolutionary groups fought against French military control across the country. Despite French attempts to consolidate authority, the struggle revealed a consistent pattern: territorial control did not equal political acceptance. Resistance continued through armed conflict, political organization, and widespread civilian support, ultimately making colonial rule increasingly difficult to sustain. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's colonial period was not a story of simple domination, it was a prolonged struggle between imposed structures and persistent resistance. Because even under foreign rule, control was never absolute. Rubber plantations changed everything. In the early 20th century, Vietnam was reshaped not by industry for its own people, but by extraction for an empire thousands of kilometers away. Under French colonial rule in Indochina, the economy was structured around one core objective: exporting raw materials. Among the most important of these were rice and rubber, both developed on a massive scale to supply global markets and French industry. Rubber, in particular, became central to this system. Driven by the rise of the automobile industry in Europe, France expanded large-scale rubber plantations across southern Vietnam, especially in Cochinchina and Annam. These plantations turned the region into one of the world's key rubber-producing zones, tightly integrated into global industrial demand. But this development came at a cost. Colonial authorities imposed heavy taxes, enforced labor systems, and relied on poorly protected plantation workers to maintain production. Economic gains flowed outward, toward colonial administration and French investors, while local populations were largely excluded from the wealth being generated. Rice production was expanded through major irrigation projects, yet per capita consumption for many Vietnamese actually declined as export priorities took precedence over local needs. And the implication is clear. Rubber plantations were not just agricultural projects, they were part of a larger colonial system designed to reorganize land, labor, and resources around external demand. Because under French rule, Vietnam was not only cultivated, it was extracted. Ideas spread through print. In the early 20th century, Vietnam's struggle for identity was not fought only on battlefields, but increasingly through words, ink, and the pages of emerging newspapers. As Western printing technology spread under French colonial rule, a new form of communication took shape: Vietnamese language journalism and literature, written in Quoc Ngu and circulated across urban centers like Hanoi and Saigon. These publications became more than information, they became tools of political awakening. At first, newspapers focused on culture, education, and social reform. But over time, they evolved. By the 1920s and 1930s, a growing network of writers, journalists, and intellectuals began using print media to circulate nationalist ideas, criticizing colonial policies, translating political theory, and encouraging discussions on independence and identity. Some publications were openly reformist. Others were more radical, operating under censorship or in exile. But together, they formed a shared intellectual current that connected urban readers with emerging nationalist movements. This was not accidental. Print allowed ideas to move faster than authorities could control them, turning literacy into a political force and transforming newspapers into instruments of mobilization. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's nationalist movement did not grow only from conflict, it also grew from communication. Because in the early 20th century, revolution did not begin with weapons. It began with words on a page. A war fought in jungles. In Vietnam, the battlefield was not defined by cities or open front lines, but by dense forests, hidden rivers, and terrain that reshaped the entire logic of war. This was the environment where guerrilla warfare became the dominant strategy, used extensively by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces against technologically superior opponents. Instead of conventional battles, combat was built around mobility, concealment, and surprise. Small units moved through jungle paths, striking quickly before disappearing back into the landscape, avoiding sustained engagements where firepower would decide the outcome. The terrain itself became a weapon. Thick vegetation limited visibility, making it difficult for larger forces to locate or maintain contact with enemy units. Ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and booby traps were used to disrupt supply lines and weaken morale over time rather than achieve victory in a single confrontation. What made this approach effective was not just tactics, but deep familiarity with the environment. Underground tunnel systems, hidden supply routes, and local support networks allowed forces to move, resupply, and regroup without detection. Even advanced technology struggled in this setting. Air power and artillery had limited impact when opponents could vanish into terrain that offered constant cover and concealment. And the implication is clear. Vietnam was not a traditional battlefield, it was an adaptive environment where control depended less on occupying land and more on understanding it. Because in this war, the jungle wasn't just where fighting happened. It was what decided how the war was fought. Tunnels beneath the battlefield. In the dense terrain of southern Vietnam, the war was not only fought on the surface, it was fought underground. Hidden beneath the Siu Chi region lay an extensive network of tunnels, built and expanded over decades of conflict. What began as small dugouts during resistance against French colonial forces later evolved into a vast subterranean system used extensively during the Vietnam War. These tunnels were not simple passages. They formed a layered underground environment with storage rooms, living quarters, command centers, medical stations, and supply routes, allowing fighters to remain hidden for long periods while continuing coordinated operations above ground. Their strategic function was precision-based. Fighters used the tunnels to move undetected, avoid aerial surveillance, and emerge unexpectedly for short strikes before disappearing again beneath the earth. This created a system of warfare built on concealment and mobility rather than direct confrontation. Some sections even connected villages and extended across wide distances, forming a hidden network that supported communication and coordination across regions. And the implication is clear. The battlefield was no longer just what could be seen. It was also what remained hidden beneath it. Because in Siu Chi, survival depended on vanishing into the ground itself. Air power versus adaptation. In the Vietnam War, one of the most advanced air forces in the world faced an opponent that rarely fought in the open, and rarely stayed in one place for long. The United States relied heavily on large-scale bombing campaigns, air superiority, and rapid aerial response to locate and destroy enemy positions across South Vietnam and the North. But the effectiveness of air power was constantly challenged by a different kind of warfare, one built on concealment and survival within the environment itself. Rather than meeting firepower with firepower, Vietnamese forces adapted. They used camouflage, dispersed movement, and dense terrain cover to remain difficult to detect from the air. Jungle canopy, false trails, and hidden positions reduced visibility, while underground systems allowed movement and shelter away from aerial surveillance. Even when airstrikes intensified, the structure of the conflict made complete disruption difficult. Smaller, highly mobile units required limited supplies and could reappear after strikes had passed, continuing operations across vast and complex terrain. And the key shift was this. Air power was designed to target visible, fixed positions. But the battlefield in Vietnam often offered neither. Instead, it became a dynamic system of concealment and re-emergence, where survival depended on blending into the land rather than holding it. And the implication is clear. Technology alone did not define control of the battlefield. Adaptation did. Because in Vietnam, what could not be seen was often what could not be stopped. A turning point in global opinion. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the Vietnam War became something new in modern history, not only a conflict fought in Southeast Asia, but a war experienced in real time inside living rooms across the world. For the first time at this scale, television journalism brought direct battlefield imagery into civilian homes, showing combat footage, casualties, and the daily realities of war with unprecedented immediacy. This shift transformed Vietnam into what many historians later called the First Television War. As coverage expanded, so did public awareness. Reports, photographs, and nightly broadcasts increasingly shaped how audiences interpreted the conflict, connecting distant military operations to emotional, human consequences that were previously unseen in earlier wars. This visibility had a major psychological effect. For many viewers, the contrast between official government optimism and on-the-ground reporting created growing tension and doubt about the war's progress and purpose. Over time, this contributed to a wider shift in perception, as public opinion became more divided and increasingly engaged with questions about legitimacy, strategy, and cost. But the historical debate remains complex. Some studies argue that media coverage alone did not directly determine public opinion, while others highlight its role in amplifying emotional responses and accelerating skepticism toward the war. And the implication is clear. The Vietnam War was not only fought on battlefields, it was also interpreted through images, reporting, and narrative framing that reached global audiences instantly. Because for the first time, war was not just witnessed by soldiers. It was witnessed by the world. From war to rapid growth. In just a few decades, Vietnam has undergone one of the most dramatic economic transformations in Southeast Asia, shifting from a war-torn, centrally planned system to a rapidly expanding, export-driven economy. Following the economic reforms known as Doi Moi in the late 1980s, Vietnam began transitioning toward a market-oriented model, opening its economy to foreign investment and global trade. This shift fundamentally changed production, industry, and urban development across the country. The results have been significant. In recent years, Vietnam has consistently recorded strong GDP growth rates, often among the highest in the region, driven by manufacturing, electronics exports, foreign direct investment, and a rapidly expanding services sector. Major industrial zones have emerged around cities like Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi, and Da Nang, integrating Vietnam into global supply chains for textiles, electronics, and consumer goods. At the same time, rising tourism and domestic consumption have added new layers to economic expansion. This growth has also attracted substantial foreign investment, as multinational companies relocate or diversify manufacturing operations into Vietnam due to its strategic location and competitive labor force. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's modern economy is not defined by its past conflicts, but by its capacity to rebuild, adapt, and integrate into a global system at remarkable speed. Because in the space of a single generation, a country once shaped by war has become one shaped by growth. A global coffee powerhouse. Today, Vietnam stands at the center of the global coffee trade, not as a minor producer, but as one of the most influential forces shaping the world's coffee supply. In fact, Vietnam is consistently ranked as the second largest coffee exporter in the world, behind only Brazil. Its production is heavily dominated by Robusta beans, a variety widely used in espresso blends and instant coffee due to its strong flavor and high caffeine content. But this position was not always expected. Coffee was introduced during the French colonial period, yet it was only after economic reforms in the late 20th century that production expanded rapidly. Through large-scale cultivation in the Central Highlands, Vietnam transformed itself from a modest producer into a global agricultural heavyweight. Today, the scale is striking. Vietnam produces a significant share of global Robusta output, over 40%, making it a critical supplier for international coffee brands, roasters, and instant coffee industries worldwide. And the economic impact reflects that dominance. In recent years, coffee exports have reached record levels of over $8 billion annually, reinforcing Vietnam's position as a central node in the global coffee supply chain. And the implication is clear. Vietnam is no longer just part of the coffee market, it helps define it. Because behind every cup of strong, dark coffee, there's a high chance it began here. A coastline of opportunity. Stretching along the edge of the South China Sea, Vietnam's geography is defined by water, over 3,000 kilometers of coastline that has quietly become one of its most powerful economic assets. But this coastline is not just scenic, it is strategic. Across its length, Vietnam has developed a dense network of ports and maritime hubs, connecting the country to major global shipping routes between East Asia, Southeast Asia, and beyond. These coastal gateways handle a large share of the nation's exports, from electronics and textiles to agricultural goods and seafood. What makes this even more significant is scale. Vietnam's seaport system has expanded rapidly, now forming a nationwide logistics backbone that supports its export-driven economy and links industrial zones directly to international markets. In recent years, container traffic has grown steadily, reflecting Vietnam's rising role in global supply chains, especially as manufacturing shifts across Asia. And the geography itself gives it an advantage. Its long, continuous coastline places major population centers and industrial regions close to maritime routes, reducing transport distances and increasing trade efficiency. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's coastline is not just a border, it is an economic engine. Because every port, every shipment, and every trade route tells the same story. Opportunity flows where land meets the sea. Ancient traditions still thrive. Across Vietnam, the past is not locked in museums or written only in history books, it is still lived, practiced, and repeated in everyday life. From the rhythm of festivals to the details of family rituals, cultural traditions remain deeply embedded in how communities celebrate time, memory, and identity. One of the most important examples is Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, a nationwide festival centered on family reunions, ancestral worship, and symbolic food preparation that marks renewal and continuity each year. But Tet is only one layer. Vietnamese culture is shaped by long-standing practices such as ancestor worship, where families maintain altars in their homes, offering food, incense, and prayers to honor relatives believed to continue guiding the living. Alongside spiritual customs, daily life is also defined by tradition. Food culture plays a central role. Regional dishes, shared meals, and seasonal specialties are not just cuisine, but expressions of identity passed through generations. Even festivals across the country, from village celebrations to national holidays, continue to reinforce community bonds, combining ancient beliefs with modern life in ways that remain visibly active today. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's culture is not a preserved artifact of the past, it is a living system, continuously practiced and reshaped without losing its roots. Because here, tradition doesn't survive by being remembered. It survives by being lived. It's not just a war story. Vietnam's history is often reduced to a single modern chapter, but in reality, that chapter sits inside a much larger timeline that stretches back thousands of years. Long before the Vietnam War, the region was home to early civilizations such as the Dong Son culture, built around advanced bronze technology and wet rice agriculture. Over time, Vietnam developed layered cultural systems shaped by indigenous traditions, regional exchange, and long periods of foreign influence, including over a millennium of Chinese rule. Across these centuries, Vietnam was not culturally static. It absorbed and adapted major philosophical systems like Confucianism, which deeply influenced governance, education, and social structure through imperial examination systems that selected scholar officials based on knowledge rather than birth alone. At the same time, Vietnamese literature, identity, and political thought continued to evolve, shaped by both external influence and strong internal continuity. Written traditions in Chinese characters and later Vietnamese scripts reflect a long intellectual history that predates modern statehood. And this pattern continues through later centuries: colonial transformation, nationalist movements, and economic reform, each layer adding complexity rather than replacing what came before. And the implication is clear. Vietnam is not defined by a single conflict or a single era. Because its real story is not one of interruption, but of continuous adaptation across millennia. A country of resilience. Vietnam's identity is not defined by a single moment in history, but by a long pattern of surviving disruption, adapting to pressure, and rebuilding across centuries of change. From ancient civilizations in the Red River Delta to periods of foreign rule, colonial restructuring, and modern conflict, Vietnam's history is marked by repeated transformation rather than stability. Across these eras, society did not disappear under pressure, it reorganized, absorbed influence, and rebuilt its institutions in new forms. This pattern became especially clear in the modern era. After decades of war and isolation, Vietnam shifted into large-scale reconstruction and reform, gradually rebuilding its economy and integrating into global systems. The post-1945 period, in particular, is described as a continuous process of national rebuilding and reinvention, shaped by both hardship and recovery. But the deeper point is not just survival, it is adaptation. Vietnamese cultural identity has consistently evolved through external influence and internal continuity, balancing change while preserving core traditions. This ability to maintain identity while transforming structures is often described as cultural resilience. And the implication is clear. Vietnam's story is not simply one of endurance through hardship, it is a long-term process of rebuilding systems, redefining identity, and adjusting to every historical shift without disappearing into it. Because over time, resilience is not just how Vietnam survives history. It is how it continues to reshape it. Vietnam's story is not defined by a single era, a single war, or a single narrative. Across centuries, the region has experienced cycles of conquest, resistance, and renewal, yet through each phase, core elements of its identity have endured. Cultural traditions, language, and social structures evolved under pressure, but they did not disappear. They adapted. What often gets lost in simplified accounts is the continuity. The same forces that shaped early resistance against foreign rule also influenced modern political movements. The same patterns of adaptation that sustained communities through imperial control continue to shape Vietnam's economic and cultural development today. Because Vietnam is not just a place where history happened. It is a place where history persisted, through disruption, through change, and through reconstruction. And the implication is clear. Understanding Vietnam requires looking beyond conflict and examining the deeper, long-term processes that shaped it. Because when you do, the story becomes not just about war, but about how a nation endures.